In the autumn of 1889, in the silver town of Quartz Bend in the Idaho Territory, a woman of 28 years old stood at the back of a crowd and bought a ruin for $1. The building had been a bank. Now it was a black shell standing at the head of Front Street, its roof fallen in, its windows blown out, its bricks scorched the color of old blood. Fire had taken it in the spring, and the town had let it stand all summer because no one wished to own it. The auctioneer read the lot description and laughed before he finished, and the men around him laughed with him because everyone knew what was inside the burned bank, and everyone knew that no one had been able to open it. Her name was Ada Coyle, and she set her dollar on the table without a word. What the town saw was a thing already finished, a husk that had held money once and held nothing now, a place where a fire had eaten through floors and walls and left only the smell of char that rain could not wash out. What Ada saw was different. She had spent her girlhood at the side of a man who built the very thing the fire had failed to destroy. And she knew, the way a daughter knows her father's hand, that the iron box in the cellar of that ruin had not given up its contents. It had only been waiting. And what she had come to believe in the months since a letter reached her with the news of her own dispossession was that the box was waiting for her. This is a story about a thing the world threw away, and the woman who knew how to listen to it. If it moves you, stay through to the end, and tell me afterward whether you have ever owned a thing that everyone else called worthless. For now, let us go back to the spring, and to the fire, and to the man whose name was burned into the door of the vault that would not burn. Her father had been Thomas Coyle, and he had built safes, not sold them, not installed them only, but built them in a shop in Sacramento where the heat of the forge never died, and the floor was always gray with iron filings. He had learned the trade in the East before the war, in the years when a vault was a craftsman's signature and not a catalog number. And he had carried that learning west when the rush was on, and the new towns wanted iron they could trust. Ada had been raised in the noise of it. She had learned to read a lock the way other children learn to read a primer, by the feel of the wards under a pick, by the small resistances that meant a thing was working, and the smaller resistances that meant a thing was wrong. Thomas Coyle had died when Ada was 24, of a sickness in the lungs that the forge smoke had made worse over 30 years, and he had left her two things. The first was a set of tools, wrapped in oiled canvas, that no one else in the world knew how to use. The second was a memory she returned to often. He had told her, near the end, that a good vault was an honest thing. It kept what it was given and gave back exactly that, and it did not care whether the hand that built it was rich or poor, or remembered. Build it right, he had said, and it will outlast every man who ever doubted you. She had thought it was only a craftsman's pride. She would come to understand it was something nearer to a prophecy. For 3 years after his death, Ada had worked where she could, repairing locks for a hardware merchant, fitting safes for shopkeepers who did not quite trust a woman's hands until they saw the work. She had saved what she could. And then, in the winter of 1888, a letter had come from a lawyer in Boise, and the small life she had built came apart in a single afternoon. The letter told her that her father's old partner, a man named Harlan Sefton, had filed a claim against the Coyle estate. There had been a debt, the letter said, a loan made years ago against the Sacramento shop with papers to prove it, and the debt had passed to Sefton, and Sefton now owned the shop and the tools and the name. Ada knew there had been no such loan. Her father had spoken of Sefton only once, and only to say that the man had left the partnership owing money, not lending it, and had gone north to the territories to become respectable. Knowing a thing and proving it were two different distances, however, and the papers Sefton held were stamped and witnessed and filed, and Ada had nothing but her memory of a dying man's voice. The court in Sacramento found for Sefton in a single morning. Ada Coyle was put out of her father's shop with a canvas roll of tools and the clothes she stood in. She might have gone east. She might have married, as the merchant's wife kept suggesting, and let the whole matter sink under the years. Instead, she went north, to the territory where Harlan Sefton had made himself a banker, because she had remembered something the lawyer's letter had let slip. The debt papers, the letter said, had been deposited for safekeeping in the vault of Sefton's own bank, in a town called Quartz Bend, where Sefton was president and chief stockholder and the most respected man on Front Street. Ada had read that line a dozen times. The papers that had ruined her were sitting in a steel box behind an iron door, and the man who had built that iron door, she felt almost certain, was her father. By the time she reached Quartz Bend, the bank had burned. She heard the story before she had been in town a day. The fire had started in the assay office next door on a windy night in April, and had jumped the gap and taken the bank entire, roof and floors and the great oak counter, and the president's polished desk. 3 men had fought it and failed, and by morning the Quartz Bend Savings and Trust was a roofless box of scorched brick, and Harlan Sefton was a banker without a bank. He had moved his accounts to a rival institution and announced that he would rebuild. The insurance men had come and gone, and in the cellar of the ruin, untouched, sat the vault. It had not opened. That was the part the town could not get past. The fire had been hot enough to warp the rail spikes in the assay yard and melt the glass in every window on the block, and still the vault had held. Sefton's own clerks had tried the combination in the days after, when the brick had cooled and the dial had turned, and nothing had happened. The locking bolts had seized. Whether from the heat or from some damage in the works, no one could say. Sefton had sent for a man from Salt Lake who advertised himself as an expert in such matters, and the man had spent 2 days at the door with drills and charges and had given up, declaring the box ruined beyond entry, the contents surely cooked to ash inside. Sefton had the man paid and sent away, and there the vault sat, sealed, in a building no one wanted, holding whatever it held. When the territory put the burned lot up for auction to recover the unpaid taxes, Sefton did not bid. Why would he? He had told everyone who would listen that the contents were destroyed, that the deeds and notes and certificates inside were so much black powder now, that the cost of opening the thing would exceed anything that could be salvaged. He was a wealthy man rebuilding a bank. A scorched ruin with a dead safe in its cellar was a liability, and he was glad to let the territory carry it off his books. Ada Coyle bought it for $1 because hers was the only bid. The auctioneer, a fat, genial man named Pell, could not help himself. He told her as he wrote out the deed that she now owned the heaviest paperweight in the territory, and that if she ever found a way to move the vault, she might sell it for scrap, though the freight to a foundry would cost her more than the iron was worth. The men on the boardwalk took up the joke. One of them asked whether she meant to live in it. Another said she had bought herself a chimney with no house attached. Ada folded the deed into her satchel and thanked Mr. Pell for his trouble, and walked up Front Street to look at what was hers. And behind her the laughter went on a while, and then, as laughter does, found nothing more to feed on and died. She stood in the doorway of the burned bank for a long time. The smell was the first thing, char and wet ash and the mineral tang of scorched brick, a smell that got into the back of the throat and stayed. The roof was gone entirely, and the autumn sky stood open above the blackened walls, and the floor of the main room was a litter of fallen timber and broken slate. and the twisted iron of what had been the teller's cage. At the rear, a stairway of stone descended into the cellar, and the stone had held where the wood had burned, and at the bottom of the stair, in the cool dark below the reach of the fire, stood the vault. It was larger than she had expected and finer. A freestanding iron strong room the size of a small cabin, its door a single slab of layered steel, and iron taller than she was, its face fitted with a four-spoke wheel and a combination dial, and a maker's plate above the dial that the smoke had blackened past reading. The hinges were buried in the frame, 3 of them, each as thick as her wrist. She put her bare hand flat against the door, and the iron was cold, the deep cold of a thing that the summer heat had never reached, the cold of a cellar that the fire had roared above but never entered. She stood with her hand on the cold iron and felt under her palm the work of a careful man. Then she reached up with her sleeve and rubbed at the maker's plate, at the soot baked onto the brass, and rubbed until the lateral light from the cellar window caught the engraved letters. She did not need to read all of it. She needed only the first line, and the first line said, "Coil," and below it in the smaller script her father had always used for the city, Sacramento. She had been right. Her father had built this vault, and her father had taught her that a vault he built was an honest thing that kept what it was given and gave it back to the right hand. What the town did not know, and what Sefton had counted on no one ever learning, was that Thomas Coyle had built his vaults with a particular care that he had taught only to his daughter. The combination dial and the wheel were the public face of the lock, the part any cracksman from Salt Lake would assault. Coyle had distrusted the public face. In every vault he built for a customer he respected, and in some he built for customers he did not, he had set a second mechanism, a relocking device of his own design, that engaged when the door was forced or when the works were damaged by heat or shock. Once that device had thrown, the dial was useless. No combination on earth would retract the bolts, because the bolts were no longer answering the dial. They were held by the relocker, and the relocker could be released only by a man who knew it was there, and who knew the small sequence of pressures that stood it down. The expert from Salt Lake had drilled at the dial for 2 days and accomplished nothing, because he had been fighting the wrong battle against an enemy he did not know existed. Ada knew it existed. She had watched her father build a dozen of them, and as she stood in the cold cellar with her hand on the door, she understood why the vault had not opened, and she understood that she was very likely the only living person who could open it. She did not start that day. She was a careful worker, and her father's first lesson had been that haste broke more locks than force. She found a room above the livery for $2 a week, and she took the measure of her situation. She had perhaps $11 left, the canvas roll of tools, a deed to a ruin, and a conviction that somewhere behind 3 thicknesses of steel sat the papers that would prove Harlan Sefton a thief. She had no proof yet that the papers had survived. She had only her father's word, spoken across the years, that a Coyle vault kept what it was given. She chose to believe him. There was nothing else to believe in. For a week she did nothing but study. She came to the cellar each morning with a lamp and a notebook, and she sat before the door and read it the way her father had taught her to read a thing, slowly, without assumption. She found the seam where the heat had warped the upper frame a fraction, enough to bind. She found the maker's plate and cleaned it fully and copied the serial number into her notebook, a number that told her the year of manufacture, and by her father's old system, the class of relocker fitted inside. She found, low on the door, a small round plug of softer metal, a detail no one else would have noticed, a detail that was not a flaw, but a door within the door, the access her father always left for himself. She did not tell anyone what she had found. In a town that had laughed at her, knowledge was the only wealth she had, and she kept it. It was in that first week that the old man found her. His name was Eli Mercer, and he had been the night watchman at the Quartz Bend Savings and Trust for 19 years, until the fire took the building and the job with it. He was past 70, lean and bent, with hands that shook a little when they were idle and steadied when they had work to do. He came down the cellar stair on the fourth morning and stood watching her without speaking, and when she finally looked up, he said only that he had wondered who would be fool enough to buy the place, and that she did not look like a fool. Ada said that remained to be seen. The old man laughed, a dry sound, and sat down on the bottom step, and that was the beginning of it. Eli Mercer had watched that vault for 19 years. He had seen it installed in the winter of 1870, when a freight team had hauled it up from the railhead over 4 days, and a crew of 8 had wrestled it down into the cellar on rollers and oak skids. He remembered the man who had come with it, a Sacramento man, gray and quiet, who had spent a week fitting it and testing it, and who had told Eli the night before he left that the box would outlast every man in the building. Ada asked him to describe the man. Eli described her father. She turned away so the old man would not see her face, and when she had command of it again, she asked him whether he would help her and what he wanted for it. Eli Mercer said he wanted to see the thing open before he died, because he had spent 19 years guarding a door, and he had a watchman's curiosity about what was behind it. He asked for no money. He had a small pension and a smaller cabin, and he was, he said, too old to want much beyond an answer. So they became 2, and 2, in that cellar, was a great deal more than 1. The work began in earnest in the second week, and it was slow, and the slowness is the truest part of this story. Ada did not blast, and she did not drill the dial. She worked the relocker, which meant she worked the small plug low on the door within the door, and behind it the access channel her father had built. It was fouled with baked grease and soot, and the first 3 days were nothing but cleaning, working solvent into the channel with a syringe and drawing the filth out again and again until the slender probes of her father's tools could pass. Eli held the lamp and asked careful questions and learned in his patient old way the names of the tools and the logic of the thing. On the 4th day, a probe reached the relocker for the first time, and Ada felt, through 18 inches of steel and the length of a steel rod, the faint, cold kiss of the device that had defeated the man from Salt Lake. She marked the depth on the rod with a file and went up into the daylight and sat on the cellar stair and shook for a while, not from fear, but from the nearness of it. She told Eli that night over the supper he insisted on sharing that her father had set the relocker to stand down in a sequence, and that she remembered the principle of the sequence, but not the exact figures for this particular class, and that the figures were the whole battle. 3 pressures in order, at 3 depths, each held for a count, each released cleanly. Wrong order, and the device set harder. Too much force, and a part inside would shear, and the door would be sealed forever, beyond any hand. She had 1 chance at it, or near to 1, and she did not yet know the figures. Eli asked how she would learn them. Ada said the figures were a function of the serial number, by a system her father had carried in his head and written nowhere, a system he had taught her in pieces over years without ever saying that was what he was doing. She had been working the arithmetic of it in her notebook every night. She was close. She was not certain, and certainty in this was the only thing worth having. While she worked the door, the town worked on her. Word had got around that the woman who bought the ruin was down in the cellar every day doing something to the safe, and the town found this funnier than the purchase had been. Men came to the doorway of the burned bank to look down the stair and call out questions. Had she found the gold yet? Did she need a strong back, or a strong head? Pell the auctioneer brought a friend by to show him the heaviest paperweight in the territory and the woman who thought she could lift it. Ada did not answer them. She had learned long ago that answering doubt only fed it, and that the only reply worth making to a man who said a thing could not be done was the thing itself, done. She kept the cellar dark to discourage watchers, and she worked. It was in the third week that Harlan Sefton came. He came alone on a weekday morning, and he came down the stair quietly, and Ada did not know he was there until Eli stiffened beside her. Sefton was a tall man, well past 50, dressed in gray wool that the cellar dust did not seem to dare to settle on, with a clean-shaven face and pale eyes, and the unhurried manner of a man who had never in his life been told to wait. He looked at the vault, and he looked at the tools laid out on their canvas, and he looked at Ada Coyle, and he smiled the way a man smiles at a child building a dam in a creek. He introduced himself courteously. He said he had heard that the new owner of the property was attempting to open the old vault, and that he had come, as a neighbor and a man with some experience of such things, to spare her wasted effort. The vault, he said, was ruined. The finest expert in the Mountain West had said so. Whatever had been inside was ash. He had himself written off the contents months ago. Certain papers of no value to anyone but the parties named, long since reconstructed from copies. There was nothing in the box but cinders, and she was a young woman spending the autumn in a cold cellar chasing cinders, and he would, out of pure goodwill, buy the property back from her for $10, 10 times what she had paid, so that she might go and make a better use of her winter. Ada listened to all of it without setting down her tools. When he had finished, she said that it was a generous offer, and that she would think on it, and that she thanked him for his concern. She did not say that he had told her, in his courtesy, exactly what she had come 300 miles to confirm. He knew the papers were in the vault. He had named them, certain papers, of no value to anyone but the parties named, and a man does not offer $10 for a chimney with no house attached unless something in that chimney can hurt him. He had said the contents were ash. Harlan Sefton had no way of knowing whether the contents were ash, however, because Harlan Sefton could not open the vault. Only a Coyle could, and his coming down the stair to make her an offer had told her that he was not as certain of the ash as he wished her to be. He went back up into the daylight, gray and unhurried, and Ada watched him go, and Eli let out a breath he had been holding for 10 minutes, and said that in 19 years he had never once seen Sefton come down to the cellar. Not once. Ada said that was worth knowing. Then she bent back to the door. That night she did not sleep. She sat in her room above the livery with the lamp turned low and the notebook open and the serial number written at the top of the page. And she worked the arithmetic of her father's system through to the end. And then she worked it again, and a third time, by 3 different paths, the way he had taught her, because a figure you reach by one road may be an error, and a figure you reach by 3 roads is the truth. The 3 roads met. She had her figures, 3 pressures, 3 depths, 3 counts, in an order she now believed she knew the way she knew her own name. She closed the notebook and put out the lamp and lay in the dark with her heart going hard, because tomorrow she would either open her father's vault or shear the part inside and seal it forever. And there was no third outcome, and no second attempt. She did not see it yet, the thing that was coming. You might. In the morning, she went down early before the town was awake with Eli at her side carrying the lamp. She cleaned the access channel one final time. She fitted the long probes and set the marks she had filed. She told Eli in a low, even voice what she was about to do and what each sound would mean, so that if her hands failed, he would understand what had happened. Then she began. The first pressure went in at the shallowest depth, and she held it for the count, and released it, and felt nothing change, which was correct because the first pressure only woke the device. The second went deeper, to the second mark, and this was the one that could shear, and she set her shoulder and her breath and gave it the exact force her father's hand had taught hers across 1,000 repetitions she had not known were lessons, no more and no less, and held it and released it. And deep in the door, faint as a heartbeat in another room, something moved. Eli heard it too. His old hand tightened on the lamp. The third pressure went to the deepest mark, and she held it for the long count, 8. And on 8 she released it cleanly, all at once, the way you release a held note, and not the way you drop a weight. For a moment, nothing. Then, from inside the great door came a sound she had heard only in her father's shop, the sound of a relocker standing down, a long descending series of small iron clicks, like a chain run slowly off a table, ending in a single heavy thunk that she felt in the soles of her feet. The bolts were free. The dial answered the works again. She turned to Eli and saw that the old man had tears standing in his eyes and did not seem to know it. She still had to work the combination, and that she did from her father's records, the installation figures Eli remembered being set, and the dial turned sweet and true now that the relocker had led it, and on the fourth turn the wheel sank under her hand. She gripped the 4 spokes and braced her boots and pulled, and the great door, balanced on its buried hinges with a craftsman's perfection, even after the fire, swung open against 19 years, and one inferno as smoothly as a cupboard in a kitchen. The air that came out was cold and dry and old, the still air of a sealed place, untouched by the fire that had raged a body's length above it, and it smelled of oiled steel and paper, and nothing burned at all. Inside the vault was whole. The fire had never entered. The shelves stood in their ranks, and on the shelves sat the strong boxes and the ledgers and the bundled papers of the Quartz Bend Savings and Trust, dusty, cold, perfectly preserved, exactly as they had been left on the last night before the fire. Harlan Sefton had told the town the contents were ash. The contents were not ash. The contents were evidence. Ada did not touch them at first. She stood in the open door and let the old cold air move past her into the cellar. And she thought of her father in his gray week of fitting this box, telling a watchman that it would outlast every man in the building, and she understood that it had. Then she lit a second lamp and went in, with Eli at the threshold as her witness, and she began to read. She found her own family's papers first, because she had come for them, and because Sefton, careful in all things, had kept them in a labeled box of their own, the loan agreement that had cost her the shop. She read it through twice, and on the second reading she saw what her grief had hidden from her in the lawyer's office 2 years before, the thing her father's trained eye would have caught in an instant. The paper was a forgery, and not even a careful one to a craftsman's eye. The date at the head of the document was 1879. The paper bore, however, pressed faint into its lower corner, the dry stamp of the mill that had made it, and Ada knew mill stamps the way she knew everything made by careful hands, because her father had bought paper by the ream for 30 years and taught her to read its marks. The stamp was a design the mill had not used until 1884. The document Sefton swore had been signed in 1879 had been written on paper that did not exist until 5 years later. It was a lie a court could see. It was a lie that did not depend on her memory of a dying man's voice. It was a lie pressed into the very paper it was written on, and it had been sitting in this cold box the whole time, waiting for the one hand that could open the door. There was more, and it was not only hers. As she worked through the ledgers in the days that followed, with Eli keeping the cellar and turning away the curious, she found that the false loan against the coil shop was not the only one. Harlan Sefton had built his respectability on a method, and the method filled 3 ledgers. He had made a practice over 15 years of advancing small sums to men who later died, or moved on, or could not read well, and then producing after the fact loan papers far larger than the sums advanced, papers that let him take shops and claims and parcels of land for a fraction of their worth. 12 families by Ada's count. 12 wrongs, each documented in Sefton's own hand in his own ledgers, each cross-referenced to a forged note he had been careful to keep, because a careful thief keeps his forgeries where no one can reach them. And Harlan Sefton had kept his in the one vault in the territory that could not be opened. He had been so sure. He had built his crimes a fortress and handed the only key to a dead man, and the dead man had handed it to his daughter. Now, this is the place where a different story would put a confrontation. A different story would have Ada Coyle climb the cellar stair with the ledgers in her arms and cross Front Street and throw them down on Harlan Sefton's new desk and watch his face. That is not what happened, and the reason it is not is the heart of who she was. Her father had not taught her to win arguments. He had taught her that an honest thing keeps what it is given and gives it back, and that the work speaks, and that you do not need to shout when the truth is in your hand. She did not go to Sefton at all. She went to the families. It took her the better part of the winter, and Eli Mercer went with her where the roads were hard, and the descendant of the first wrong man she found was a woman near her own age named Junie Voss, who kept a boarding house at the edge of town, and who had been a girl of 12 when Sefton took her father's freight business over a loan her father swore he never signed. Ada did not make a speech. She laid the forged note on Junie Voss's kitchen table, and beside it the page from Sefton's ledger that showed the true sum advanced, and she let Junie Voss read them in her own time. The woman read them twice, the way Ada had read her own, and then she put her face in her hands, not weeping exactly, but letting something down that she had carried for 15 years, the long weight of having been called a liar by a respectable man and having had no paper to say otherwise. When she lifted her face, she asked Ada what she wanted. Ada said she wanted nothing. She said the papers were Junie's and the truth was Junie's, and what Junie did with them was Junie's to decide. Then she went to find the next family. That is how it went, one kitchen table at a time, through the cold months. Ada Coyle never accused Harlan Sefton of anything. She did not have to. She gave each wronged family the proof of their own wrong in Sefton's own hand, and she let the proof do the work that no accusation could. By the time the spring thaw opened the roads, 11 of the 12 families had their papers, and the papers had gone, by those families' own hands, to a circuit lawyer in Boise who had no love for territorial bankers and a great love for documents that proved their own case. Harlan Sefton was not arrested in a dramatic scene. There was no scene. The circuit lawyer filed, and the territorial court took the ledgers into evidence, and the ledgers were in Sefton's own hand and could not be argued with, and one by one the false judgments he had won over 15 years were reopened and reversed. The new bank he had been so proud of rebuilding could not stand on a foundation of returned property and ruined credit. By the summer of 1890, he had sold his interest and left the territory, gone east, the way men like him always went, to a place where his name meant nothing yet. He never faced Ada Coyle across a desk. He simply became Over a single winter, a man whose foundation had been pulled out from under him by the weight of what he himself had buried. And then he was gone. And the town that had laughed at the woman in the cellar found it did not much want to talk about him anymore. The coil shop in Sacramento came back to Ada by order of the court that spring. The false loans struck down, the forgery on the paper that did not exist plain for any clerk to see. She did not go back to it. She sold it honestly and openly to a young locksmith who had apprenticed under her father, and she used the money for something else. And the something else is the last thing this story has to tell. She did not leave Quartz Bend. She had come to it with $11 and a roll of tools and a conviction, and she found she had grown into the place the way a tool grows into a hand. The burned bank was still hers, and the vault was still in its cellar, whole and cold and honest, and Ada Coyle did a thing the town had not expected. She rebuilt the bank around the vault. Not as a bank. The territory had banks enough. She rebuilt it as a shop, a safe and lockworks, the only one between Boise and the railhead, and she set her father's vault at the heart of it, cleaned and oiled and open now, its great door standing wide as a sign that the box was no longer keeping secrets, that the days of buried wrongs were finished in this town. Junie Voss kept the books. Eli Mercer, who lived 4 more years and was content in every one of them, sat by the door in good weather and told anyone who would listen about the morning the door came open after 19 years, and how he had been there, and how the air that came out was cold and smelled of nothing burned at all. The auctioneer Pell came in once, the first winter, on some small errand, and stood a while looking at the great open vault he had once called the heaviest paperweight in the territory. He did not make the joke again. He said instead that he supposed he had been wrong about the value of the lot, and Ada said that most things were worth more than the price they sold for, which was as near as she ever came to saying that she had told them so. She did not gloat. The work had said it for her, and the work went on saying it. Every day the door stood open. To anyone in that town who had ever been called worthless and made to believe it, there is a thing her father said that she had not understood until the morning the bolts came free, and understood for the rest of her life after. He had said a vault he built would outlast every man who ever doubted you. She had thought he meant the iron. She came to see he had meant something larger, that an honest thing made by honest hands keeps the truth safe through fire and years and the lies of powerful men, and gives it back, when the time comes, to the one hand that knows how to ask. Harlan Sefton had built a fortress for his crimes and trusted it to a dead man. The dead man had built it to be honest, and honesty, it turned out, was the one thing in all that iron that Sefton had never been able to account for. Years later, when Ada Coyle was an old woman and the shop had passed to others and Quartz Bend had a rail spur and a real main street and had nearly forgotten how it began, a child of the town asked her why the old open vault still stood in the corner of the shop when it held nothing and was worth nothing and only took up room. Ada was a long time answering. She put her hand flat against the cold iron of the door, the way she had the first day, in a ruin that smelled of char, when the whole town was laughing on the boardwalk above. The iron was still cold. It would always be cold. And she told the child that it was not worth nothing, that it had once held the only truth that could not be burned or bought or argued away, and that she kept it open so that no one would ever again mistake a quiet thing in the corner for a thing of no value. The child did not understand, the way children do not. The child remembered, though, the way children do, and carried it forward, which is the only way anything honest survives at all. If this story stayed with you, tell me about a time the world was certain something was worthless and turned out to be wrong. And if you would like another like it, there is the story of a woman who paid $2 for a sunken riverboat that the whole town swore the current had emptied, and found that the river keeps better secrets than any safe.